Hi, I'm James Shillinglaw from Insider Travel Report, and I'm here again with an old friend, Bill McGee, who's the Senior Fellow for Aviation and Travel for American Economic Liberties Project. And just a point of order, Bill and I used to work together for many years at various trade publications, and now he's leading the charge on airline consumer rights for the American Economic Liberties Project. And the reason why we're talking to Bill, again, we did earlier, I think it was late last year about this, is the big ruling last week now, because that's when this will appear, on that the judge in the Boston court denied the JetBlue-Spirit merger because it was anti-competitive, and we'll get into the other reasons for it. And this is something that American Economic Liberties has been really trying to get done and have that court rule in that favor. So there's not going to be a JetBlue-Spirit merger at any time soon, and we're going to talk to Bill about that and a whole lot more on Insider Travel Report. Now, Bill, first of all, great to see you. A good week for you, right?
Yeah, good to see you, James, as always. Look, we're thrilled at American Economic Liberties Project about this ruling. You'll recall we're sort of bookending here. When I last spoke to you, it was just before Halloween in late October, and I spoke to you from my hotel room in Boston. I had just gotten there. I was there for the first week of the trial.
Right.
The trial went several weeks, and then we got a pretty quick ruling. Here it is, January, and Judge Young ruled against this merger. I think for those of us who were in the courtroom, it was very hard to sort of, handicap this, as people like to do. I mean, of course, when people heard I was there, I got somebody, well, how do you think he's going to rule? And
Yeah.
it's sort of impossible to do that. The judge was asking excellent questions. I have to say, as well as I do, that the airline industry is unique. It's different than other industries. Even within the travel industry, it's unique. It has its own language, its own vocabulary. It's, when you're in court and you have lawyers talking about available seat miles and revenue passenger miles and all of this stuff, and you're new to this world, it's a big learning curve. And I have to say, and I mean this sincerely, I followed the first Boston federal court trial with JetBlue. There were two, and that was the JetBlue American Airlines Northeast Alliance trial that the DOJ filed suit against. And then, of course, I followed this one. And I have to say, it was two different judges, same courthouse,
Right.
two different judges, a federal courthouse in Boston. Judge Sorokin in the first case and Judge Young in the second case. Both of them really impressed me because I think you and I have both seen people talk about the airline industry that don't know the airline industry, and sometimes it's embarrassing. Even
Right.
journalists that sometimes are thrown into a story and they don't know what's going on and they're sort of flailing. Both of them really did their homework. I will say that, unequivocally. I was very impressed you can tell from the questions they're asking.
Yeah.
Both
Yeah.
of them, neither of these were jury trials for those that that didn't follow it closely. So the judge, will just interrupt an attorney or a witness and ask questions and say, well, what do you mean by that? Well, what about this? Well, what if this happened? And both of them really, it was clear to me they spent hours and hours learning about this industry and the nuances. And I think the ruling reflects that. And it was, for us, it was the only ruling he could have given. I mean, he basically said, he cited something that every antitrust lawyer knows very well, but the general public may not know as well, and that's the Clayton Act. And basically, it had to do with fairness in this sense. It's 109 years old,
Hmm.
and one of the raps on the Department of Justice that I heard repeatedly in recent weeks was they're overstepping their bounds. They're going to a place that's never been before. Well, that's not true. What they were doing was reasserting the authority they already had under the Clayton
Hmm.
Act. And guess what? That's exactly what Judge Young said in his ruling. I mean, I read
Right.
every word of the ruling. And he said, look, this is the Clayton Act. The fact that it's 109 years old has nothing to do with it. The Constitution is 200 years old, and we still live by that, right? So the fact is, I mean, and I've been very blunt about this, in my lifetime in this industry, and I started working in the airlines in 85, so 39 years, in my lifetime, the Department of Justice under multiple administrations was very laissez-faire on mergers, as you know. And they had never brought a case all the way to
Hmm.
trial, let alone win a trial. I testified myself many times in the House and Senate against mergers in my days when I was working at Consumer Reports. And, there was this sense that they just wanted to cut a deal. What can we do? Well, we'll give up some takeoff and landing slots at DCA, or we'll give up some gates at JFK. And that's what I was concerned that that might happen here. That isn't what happened. The judge said, no, this is anti-competitive, and it's going to be a loss for consumers if Spirit goes away.
Right.
And
Right.
he stated it in plain English. And it was a really interesting ruling. If for those that haven't read it, you might want to. At one point, he quotes lyrics from the musical Les Mis. Okay,
Just for that, you should read it.
Exactly.
At least he didn't. He wasn't up there singing it. That's
In reference to no, in reference to junk fees. Okay, it was very entertaining as well as very enlightening. In the opening, he quotes Yogi Berra, which I found interesting for a guy in Boston. As a lifelong Yankees fan myself, I thought, oh boy, that's a dangerous thing to do in Boston. Quote a Yankee. And then at the end, he says it in plain English. He says, this is for those that fly Spirit. And so, I don't know if you have questions specifically about the ruling, but to me, it was a fascinating process. And, I've been talking to reporters in the last couple of days, and people say to me, well, you always want to have some perspective. What is this? Where do we put this? We're in unprecedented territory. I know that sounds very over the top, but I mean it literally. We have never had the DOJ fight a merger and win. They have, I want to be clear, they have protested certain mergers over the years. Some of them just sort of fell apart under scrutiny. Right. Others, as you know, there were these sort of 11th hour deals where it's like, okay, we'll give up some slots, as I said, and then we'll rubber stamp it. But they never fought it all the way to the mat like this. And so we're in a new place. This is a different DOJ.
Yeah, it does seem to be the case. And now at this point with this ruling, is there any chance JetBlue or Spirit is going to appeal the ruling in some fashion? I mean, what's their recourse? Are they following? I haven't heard a word so far.
They issued a statement. It was very brief, and they said they're looking. It was what you would expect. I'm sure an attorney helped write it. It basically said we're looking at whatever legal recourse we have. I mean, what else are they going to say at this point? Are they going to? I mean, again, we're handicapping. I'm not in those rooms. I have no idea what they're really thinking. But I will say this. I mean, now I'm not trying to rub salt in the wounds, but JetBlue is 0 for 2 in federal court now in less than a year. First with the ruling earlier in 2023 against the American Airlines Alliance, and now with this ruling against the merger with Spirit. I mean, how deep are their pockets? I mean, when I was at that courtroom in Boston, and there was an army of lawyers there representing JetBlue. I mean, how long can they go on with this?
Yeah.
Clearly they were all in and they were fighting right till the end. But of course, they could file an appeal. That's always an option. But I just wonder, like, at what point do they say, well, enough is enough, and focus on running the airline rather than trying to, find a partner?
No, it definitely. So I guess the question is, where does this leave JetBlue? Where does this leave Spirit?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you asked, because I've been following this since day one, needless to say. The American Economic Liberties Project, we're all about monopoly power, monopoly power and consolidation and mergers. And, I've been following this whole saga. First, of course, it was, the dance partners changed. It was Frontier and Spirit, then it became JetBlue and Spirit. We know the whole history going back, 2 years now, all the way back to 2022. But what has happened is, the narrative changed a few times. And to me, there were some false narratives, quite frankly. And now, we're hearing, all of a sudden we're hearing, well, this means now that Spirit is going to go bankrupt. So I hope you're happy, for those of us that were opposing this merger. The fact is, I was there, as you know, I was in the courtroom on the first day of the trial when I'm almost positive the very first witness was the CEO of Spirit. I know that he was one of the first ones. I think he was the very first witness called. And he was asked under oath, plain English, if this merger does not go through, will Spirit go under? And he said, no, we have a plan B. He said it. I mean, and so he's on the record as saying that. Furthermore, as every lawyer, including the two attorneys that work in-house at American Economic Liberties with me, have said, there is something called I'm going to get this a little wrong since I'm not a lawyer, but I believe it's called a failing firm defense. In other words, that if a company is facing bankruptcy, the merger rules can be sort of expedited. And we saw that, for example, with American Airlines and TWA.
Right.
TWA's assets were acquired by American in bankruptcy court, right? So that was not a defense that was used. The CEO under oath said it wasn't, and now suddenly, every armchair pundit is saying it's a narrative that came out of nowhere. Basically, it came out in the middle of this trial. Suddenly, it was not the case that the lawyers are making in court for Spirit and JetBlue. They were not saying if this deal doesn't go through, Spirit is going to go bankrupt. And now we're hearing that. I think it's a bit of a false narrative, to be very blunt about it. If that were the case, they had ample opportunity to make that case, and they did not. And as I said, if we can't take the word of the CEO of Spirit, then whose word can we take?
Right.
So I think it's a bit bogus. And quite frankly, I think it's a playbook that I don't know if you're going to get to this, but I'm not trying to switch gears, but we also have another pending merger.
No, let's talk about that in a little while, because
but that we're hearing,
and so far
that narrative there too, that if Alaska and Hawaiian don't merge, then Hawaiian will go bankrupt. Again, there's methodology in the court to prove those things. If you're not going to prove it, then it's then why bring it up?
Well, it's interesting because I know Spirit has been proceeding as if they were a separate airline. They've been making lots of announcements, lots of new routes, other programs, everything else, as if this was never going to happen.
Yeah.
And I was always thinking to myself, well, that could all be out the window if JetBlue does acquire Spirit, because they may decide those are not the things they want to do. But Spirit was proceeding as normal.
Right. And you're very right, James. I mean, you're bringing up an excellent point. If they were flailing and facing, bankruptcy, would they be making all of these plans in the meantime? They clearly had a plan B all along. And, whether they read the tea leaves and thought the case was not going to go their way or whatever, I don't know. But, doesn't matter. The fact is that Spirit has its own course, that they have to play. We know that their stock declined in recent days. That's to be expected after an announcement like this. But, again, they maintain that they will survive. And so,
right.
They are the nation's largest ultra low cost carrier, as was stated over and over again in court. And I think, as you well know, but maybe, a lot of the American public doesn't realize, there's a big, big difference between an ultra low cost carrier and a low cost carrier. That's what we're talking about, the difference between Spirit and JetBlue, whether you're talking about service or whether you're talking about fares. And I think there was an effort to sort of blur that difference. It's like, well, the lawyers for JetBlue were saying, well, we're low cost, and it's like, yeah, but you are not in the same league with Spirit's fares. It was documented. And I was happy to see that Judge Young, in his ruling, which, I read every line of it twice, he specifically stated that in markets where JetBlue was already operating and Spirit entered, JetBlue lowered its fares, right? So that clearly shows Spirit's fares were lower. Plus, of course, that smoking gun of the redacted document that entered into the court, where, internally JetBlue was estimating that fares were going to rise post-merger,
Yeah, that's a big smoking gun.
Significantly, 25%, 40%. So, again, you can't say, well, they're both low cost. They are not. There's different grades of cost and fares in the industry. And of course, the majors are higher cost than both of them. We get that, but
except when they lower fares below the other two just to get market share. But that's
okay. So we're going to go there. Great, let's do that. Happy to talk about it.
Yeah, so that's what it drives down fares, actually. So effectively now we have Spirit on its own. Any chance that it will renew the agreement with Frontier, or is that something the DOJ is going to go after too? If, let's say, Spirit and Frontier start and try to link up again. Look,
I think it's not hyperbole, as I said, that I tweeted about this the other day, and I used the word unprecedented, and I said, unprecedented is one of those words that gets thrown around a lot, and it's not always truthful. But in this case, what we saw with this ruling was unprecedented. And for me, this is not a political thing. A lot of people try to politicize this stuff. When you're talking about policies that have been in place across 6 or 7 presidential administrations, for 40 years. To me, that's not political, right? This is not, oh, Biden did this or Trump did that or whatever. This is how it was. Whether it was Obama in office or Bush in office, the DOJ was laissez-faire about
Right.
airline mergers. I mean, that's documented for 40 years. So that's not a Democrat Republican thing to me. That's not blue or red, right? Until the Biden administration. And this administration came in and they are doing things that haven't been done. So if I am an airline CEO right now, look, we all know everybody in this industry read this ruling the other day, not just
Yep.
Spirit and JetBlue. And if I'm sure that was read very closely in Seattle at Alaska's headquarters. They were reading every line and every footnote, I'm sure. And now we have a new precedent based on this judge. And by the way, let's state the record here. Judge Young has been in office for a long time. He was appointed by President Reagan. Now, this is a guy
That's a
who
long
was
time ago.
a
Yeah.
Reagan Republican, right?
Right.
And he came out, in favor of the Clayton Act and against consolidation. And his word, now I want to be very frank with you. In recent years, I have used the word oligopoly to refer to the 4 big carriers and their sort of stranglehold on the market, controlling 80%. That's a level we've never had before in the past. Back in the old days, the biggest airlines, Pan Am, TWA, they didn't have, 80%, the top 4. None of them had 20% each. What I find interesting is Judge Young, this judge who was appointed by Ronald Reagan, he used the word oligopoly in his ruling.
Right.
Now, to me, that means we're in a whole new place now.
Right.
We're in a place we've never been. This is being acknowledged by, a Republican judge who was appointed by, one of the most conservative presidents we've had in the last half century. And he said, no, this is an industry that is an oligopoly. There's no shortage of questions about, will Frontier come back and make another run at Spirit for round 2? What's going to happen with Alaska and Hawaiian?
Yeah.
What's going to happen with JetBlue? They're going to look for a new partner now. The rumors, they just never stop. But if you're an airline CEO and you're looking at this Department of Justice, I would have to assume that you are a little leery about launching another merger attempt at this point, because this is just not the same DOJ that we have seen for the last 40 years. Right. End stop. There's nothing else to say beyond that. They have shown, that now they have not spoken publicly yet on Alaska and Hawaiian, but that's not surprising because they're doing their due diligence clearly behind closed doors, I'm sure. But I'm sure we're going to be hearing soon on that.
Yeah. So you think there's a possibility DOJ will go after the Hawaiian Alaska merger?
Look, I have no inside information. I don't know, but I have to assume it, because it's a different merger, obviously, than Spirit and JetBlue. It raises different issues, but it's problematic in its own way. There's a lot to it. We look at it as sort of a 3-front issue. I mean, you have the intra-Hawaiian market, which is unique. It's not like anything in any other state. I mean, I always say that, the thing about what Hawaiian does and what Aloha, before it went bankrupt, what it did with all that intra-island, traffic, it's not even airline service in a way. It's more like, commuter rail or bus. It's like, this is how people get to work in some cases in Hawaii. This is how they go to school. This is how they go to doctor's meetings. This is how they pick up their kids on the weekends in custody. They bounce around from island to island. It's not like, oh, we're getting on a plane and flying from Chicago to New York. And it's unique. And, to try and run that from Seattle with that culture. And, and let's not forget also, a lot of people don't realize this. Hawaiian is one of the oldest airlines in the United States, in the world, in fact. Well,
in a way, Alaska and Hawaiian are similar in that Hawaii has that inter-island thing, and Alaska has inter-Alaska.
Yes, absolutely.
That's with the Horizon and all that.
Right.
Subsidiary. So they're both doing similar functions, except now Alaska has branched out, to go all over the place. And obviously they bought Virgin America a few years back, and so now their position. So I guess they thought this was a good combination, but we're going to have to wait and see whether that's actually going to happen, right?
Yeah, well, and then they look. I mean, let's be blunt about it. They really screwed up with the Virgin America acquisition. Now, you and I both know there aren't too many fans of individual U.S. airlines these days. Not too many of them have fan clubs or Facebook pages, and yet Virgin America, I would argue, in the last 20 years, had the most loyal following of any airline in the United States
Sure.
that I've seen. I flew them myself, but you can't go by me because I fly everybody. I make a point to, never fly the same airline twice if I can avoid it. And I try and sample
That's
them
getting
all.
harder to do, though.
Well, no, true, absolutely. But I always try and sample them all. I don't want to say, well, I haven't flown them in 4 years. I try and follow, I've flown the new guys, Breeze and Avello. My point with Virgin America is they really angered a lot of people. Virgin America had a very loyal following.
Sure.
And what did they do? They came along, very different corporate culture, and I mean, Virgin America disappeared. They drowned it.
Well, also Virgin America was having a challenge because, Sir Richard Branson, who had helped to create that, but then couldn't own it because of the rules in the U.S. here about foreign
Right,
ownership. Basically had to they had to find a partner because they were no longer going to be partnered with Virgin Atlantic because guess
right,
what? Virgin Atlantic is now, half owned by Delta.
right.
So that's where Branson
Well,
went.
you're absolutely right. And look, I mean, it was a rather extraordinary merger in that Richard Branson publicly said to reporters that if he did have control of Virgin America, which, as you say, because of the U.S. law, he cannot as a foreign national. If he did, he would have prevented the Alaska merger. I mean, that
Yeah.
was, right on the eve of the merger. He said that publicly. But my point was more about the public,
Yeah.
that there was this loyal following. And I have to believe that there are people internally, in the C-suite at Alaska that know that they screwed up with Virgin America.
Yeah.
So, I think they're trying to take steps to try and say that, well, we're not going to, this isn't going to go the way that one went.
Yeah, well, I remember when I got on a plane that had been a Virgin America plane and it was now Alaska, and it still was configured as a Virgin America plane, and you would say, "Wow, this is great! It's a Virgin America plane,"
Right.
and we like that. I do
Right.
remember that. Yeah,
Right. And now Virgin America's gone, just like all the
like
long,
the
long
rest of
list
them.
of airlines that have gone, through mergers.
Yeah,
So we'll see what happens there. But I mean, again, it's very hard to prognosticate now. It really is. If you had asked me 10 years ago, what do I think of this or what do I think of that merger, it would have been a little easier because it was like, well, here comes the rubber stamp again, and there it goes. We're not there now. We're in a different place. And, we'll see how the industry responds. But again, I can't imagine there are too many airline executives after that ruling the other day saying, hey, it'd be a good idea. Let's launch a new merger.
yeah.
With this DOJ, I would be very wary.
Of course, who could knows what in the future where if we have a new administration and
Of
whether
course.
that's going to affect things, and they may be waiting for that. But just to backtrack,
But excuse me, let me just add there real quick, James. What Judge Young did in Boston was he set a new precedent too. So there's that
okay.
as well. I mean, from a judicial perspective, we're in a new place too, no matter who's president. But you're absolutely right. I mean, a new DOJ could go in another direction. Let's hope not.
Now, just to backtrack a little bit on what's going to happen with JetBlue now, we had, as we've been talking about, we had them try to do the North East Alliance with American, which I don't think they ever had their heart in that one, even though, that it did give them some advantages. Although the next time I had to book a JetBlue flight to Miami and realized, no, I'm actually in the American terminal. That was another story. But so that didn't work. The judge ruled against that, the different judge, as you mentioned.
Right.
Then we had this with the Spirit. And then we also had recently Robin Hayes, who's the CEO, announced his retirement from JetBlue. So now we have a different leadership at JetBlue. Where do they go from here? Are they desperate to have such a merger partner? I mean, I've heard crazy rumors that they would even look at. We were talking about Breeze Airways because Dave Nealman, who was one of the founders of JetBlue, the founder of JetBlue, and went off and created more airlines, and one of them is Breeze. And they're trying their best. They've got a very different strategy, and I don't quite know if it's caught on yet. But I even saw an account saying possibly, JetBlue could look at them.
Yeah, and I flew Breeze and it was a very good experience, by the way. It was ultra low cost. I'm not trying to pretend that it wasn't. You got a bottle of water and that was it. But for what I was doing, it made a lot of sense.
Right.
And couldn't beat the price, that's for sure. Um, you know, we all have, what we try and say is I never tell people this is the airline you should fly.
Right.
What I say is, you should have a choice, look, I mean, and I'm not trying to get away from the issue with Breeze. We can get back to it for a moment, but let's just talk about Spirit for a quick moment because we all know that Spirit is a problematic airline. I mean, all you have to do is Google my name and Spirit. You'll see that I've been critical of them over the years. But the point is, it's about choice. And what you cannot do, nobody, because this is documented, is deny that Spirit enters a market and offers rock bottom fares, right?
Right.
And I've told this anecdote repeatedly. I'll share it with you too. I had a friend who said to me a couple of months back when I told him I was going to Boston, he said, "Oh, what's going on?" And I told him, and he said, "Oh, Spirit." He said, I would never fly Spirit. Who cares if they go away?
Even though I got to say, they've gotten better. Spirit,
yes, I agree.
service, they've definitely gotten better. I mean, I used to be that same way. I'll never fly Spirit because of the comfort, because of the kind of piecemeal fare structure where you end up paying almost as much as you would have.
You have to do your homework, otherwise you're going to get sticker shock. Right. But my point with my friend was, I said to him, "Look, you have the right not to fly Spirit. That's your business." I said, "Who do you fly?" He said, "One of the big three." And I said, "Well, you live in Florida part-time, right?" And I said, "How often do you go to Florida?" 5 or 6 times a year. I said, "So who do you fly?" And he might have said Delta. It doesn't matter. It was one of the big three. Delta, American, United, doesn't matter. I said, "Do you understand that when you're flying on a route that Spirit flies, you're paying less? You don't have to fly Spirit to benefit from their presence." When I said that, suddenly he didn't want to see Spirit go away, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's something that a lot of people don't understand. And I get it. He's not an airline guy. But when I explained it to him, he got it, and he said, "Oh, that's very interesting." I said, if Spirit merges with JetBlue, at that point, we didn't know. I said, 48 hours later, you're going to be paying more. I mean, it's going to happen that quickly. Yeah. I mean, fares are going to go up and the big guys are going to love it because it's like they got rid of Spirit. So our point is, we did a lot of research on this and we had, our staff, we were doing a deep dive on Spirit's passengers and route by route. By the way, Spirit is not just a domestic airline. A lot of people don't realize this. They have a very extensive route map throughout the Caribbean, Central America, Latin America,
Mexico, I believe.
And so you have a lot of, in the old days, this used to be called ethnic travel. It's often referred to now as VFR, not visual flight rules, but visiting friends and relatives, right? So you have people that are going home to see their family or their family is coming to visit them. And Spirit's the only option, right? It's not, oh, I have to pay $50 more, I have to pay $100 more. It's, well, now I can't go, And those people get forgotten a lot, and I was glad to see that the DOJ the lawyers in Boston, they made this case repeatedly that if Spirit goes away, none of us want to pay more for an airfare. Of course not. And you don't and I don't, but chances are we're probably going to take the trip if the price goes up by $100, right? For some people, that means they're not going at all. And so would I like to see Spirit be a better airline on the customer service side? Yes. I'm not going to be hypocritical. I'm on the record as saying we're concerned about the tight seats and this and that and everything else, the transparency of the fees. However, I'm not here to say I don't want to see that airline, continue to exist. It serves a vital need for a lot of people. Anyway, I just wanted to put that on the record. So thank you for
well, just to get back to that Breeze statement. Actually, I'll ask it in a different way because obviously now we have all things being equal, Spirit will be out there as an ultra low cost carrier. Then we have Frontier, which keep forgetting about it. I just wrote about them today. They have a new base in Puerto Rico, for God's sake. They're expanding. And then we have the new startups, as you mentioned, Avelo and Breeze. So,
and don't forget Allegiant too. They're in the mix as well.
You know what? Absolutely. Allegiant is absolutely, that's the third. And is this enough pressure on the big four to keep fares reasonable and also to serve communities that are not served?
Well, you raise a great question. And this is another thing that I thought sort of became muddled in court. And again, kudos to Judge Young for seeing through this. JetBlue's lawyers, I noticed, kept talking about market share, and they spoke about it in national terms. They kept saying, well, we're very small compared to the big guy, which is absolutely true. I mean, it's a statistical fact, right? JetBlue is nowhere near the size of the big four, any of them individually. But here's the thing, the airline industry is not like other industries in that it's not about the national market share. If you're flying from point A to point B, you care about that market. You don't care what the big picture is, who has 20% and who has 8% and who has 4%. And so, Judge Young was very, very good about asking questions about that. And I was happy to see that, he didn't buy that argument. Airlines are different. It's just that simple. The CEO of JetBlue said in more than one interview, I saw him say it, Robin Hayes, the now soon to be ex-CEO, he said, well, we're not, speaking of JetBlue and Spirit, he said, well, we're not Coke and Pepsi. He brought up that analogy. Now, clearly he meant Coke and Pepsi, they're a duopoly that have a huge market share each, and then there are smaller, colas out there, right? But they're the two big, the two big gorillas, right? Well, that's not accurate when you look at the airline industry route by route. So I went in and then I tweeted about this and I said, well, here are some cities where JetBlue is dominant, like in Boston. And in Fort Lauderdale, Little Spirit, who, is nowhere near the size of the others, is dominant, right? And that's how it works in the airline industry. So to bring up the analogy of Coke and Pepsi, the reason it doesn't work is we all know anywhere in the United States, I mean, really anywhere in the world, but let's just stay in the United States. Anywhere in the United States, from Maine to Alaska to Hawaii to Georgia, you can walk into a grocery store and there's Coke and there's Pepsi and you can make your choice. You don't have that with the airline industry, right? Every airport is not served by Spirit, JetBlue, American, Delta, right? And so in some cases, there's 3 airlines, in some cases 2, in some cases 1. We've been doing some research on Guam. I mean, Guam, there was 1 U.S. carrier, it's United, end of story. There's some foreign carriers and that's it, right? So that's what's different about the airline industry. And so when you talk about the size of an airline, that's not as relevant if you're looking at it route by route. Yeah. And so if you look at Spirit, there are a lot of routes. And I did the homework and I did a deep dive several months back. And I was surprised to see some of the places Spirit flew that I didn't realize. Like they had a very big presence out of Chicago O'Hare. You would think they'd be out of Midway, where a lot of the coast carriers usually go to the smaller airports. But they're right there. Now, as we all know, O'Hare is a hub for not 1, but 2 of the big 3, American and United. So I saw a whole bunch of routes where there were 3 carriers serving it, O'Hare to, City X and City Y, American, United, Spirit. What do we think is going to happen if Spirit disappears, right? What are American United going to do? They're going to be popping champagne bottles, right? Because those fares are going to go the next day, right? And that's what we have to understand is that it's the size is not relevant. So in answer to your question, do these little guys, do they annoy the big guys? You bet they do. They're like, it's not like, oh, they're a fly and they're annoying them. No, they're affecting pricing in a good way for consumers. And we do, and I've said this 1,000 times. People have said to me, they've criticized Spirit. And I said, we do not want to see Spirit go away. And the thing is, you don't even have to fly Spirit to benefit from it. And that's what you have to understand,
Or Frontier in that case.
Right, exactly. I mean,
and then we have the new breed, as we were talking about with Breeze, Allegiant, and Avello. So those are all good things. I guess let's close on this. And this from your perspective, because this is your focus, is on the passenger, is on the consumer. Where does all this leave airline passengers today? From what we've been saying, really, passengers probably are better off now that this merger, the JetBlue-Spirit merger, has been nixed. Now that there's a climate where is not in favor of more airline mergers. We'll have to see what happens with Hawaiian and Alaska. But in the end, are airline passengers better off today?
No question. This was a victory for travelers because if you flip it, and I believe this sincerely, I would say it under oath. If you flip it, the harms that so upset passengers about the airline industry, many of them came from the consolidation, okay? The bad behavior of the airline industry, when you look at the debacle of 2022 and how,
Right.
the cancellations and all of that stuff, the flight disruptions, the lack of paying refunds, and people talk about bad behavior. Well, why do the airlines, engage in bad behavior? Why do they act badly? Because they can, all caps. I mean, that's the answer. And you and I both remember a time when the big guys, forget these smaller carriers, the big guys used to bash each other's brains out. You and I worked together at a time when, I was the aviation editor and you were the managing editor, and we were writing stories every week for the trade press
Right.
about, Northwest and American bashing each other's brains out with 50% off sales, right? I have a question for you. When was the last time you saw one of the big three engage in a fare sale like that, right?
No, we haven't
I
seen
haven't
that in a
seen it in
long.
20 years.
I know
Okay.
it's crazy. Although, you do see in certain markets
Yeah, yeah, individually, right.
that
But I
when you
mean,
say, I've looked at the so-called low-cost carriers, and then I,
right,
add up all the numbers, and I realize probably Delta or American is probably the same price.
right. But I've done the deep dive on this, and if you look at the quarterly DOT airfare reports, which is, they're factual, these are fares actually paid. The routes that have the highest fares in the United States are those that don't have low fare competition.
Right.
Right? No Spirit, no Frontier, no JetBlue, nothing. And the routes, conversely, that where you have the lowest fares, no surprise. There's Avello, there's Breeze, there's Frontier, there's Spirit, right? And so, but my point is competing with each other, the big guys against the big guys, as we used to see, no. And I would argue that this is one of the two key things that we at Economic Liberties believe. Two key factors here. One is the failures of deregulation. The other is the failures of consolidation. And the consolidation, you'll remember, I don't mean to go back into the past too far, but 2017, you'll remember Dr. Dow, the passenger who was dragged and beaten bloody and dragged off of a United Airlines commuter flight because they wanted his seat. And I testified at a hearing in the House Transportation a couple of weeks after that. I was the only consumer advocate sitting next to five airline CEOs, including the United chairman and CEO. And, this was as big a black eye as a corporation has gotten in this industry in the last
Mhm.
10 years. I mean, alongside Southwest last year with their debacle, but they paid for it, as we know.
Right.
And United, I mean, it behaved awful. And even a few days afterwards, they were still doubling down and blaming the passenger, the victim, basically, the guy that said, no, I paid for my seat and I don't want to leave. And they beat him up. Literally. I mean, they gave him a black eye and a concussion. And I was talking to a lot of reporters at the time after I testified. It was a 4.5 hour hearing. And I said, well, we'll see, how the market responds. Well, guess what? I waited and waited. And in the following quarter, United stock went up. Now, I would argue that there was a time where there's no way that would have happened because there was more competition and people would have. Remember, we used to use this term. You hardly ever hear it anymore. We used to use it all the time when we worked at Travel Agent Magazine. Book away. Remember? We used to say,
Oh yeah, yeah.
booking away from an airline. Sometimes it was because of a safety issue. There was an accident and they'd say, well, we're going to book away from that airline, right? Well, how are you going to book away now in much of the country? Now, in places like New York and Washington, Chicago, Los Angeles, okay, it's a different story. You have more choices. But in much of the country, how can you book away? If you live in the South, it's very hard to book away from Delta. I'm not picking on Delta. I'm just saying, and if you live, so many cities and smaller communities. So we don't have that. So that's my answer in terms of, is this a good thing? The flip side of this is it's a must. What we have said at Economic Liberties is, first, let's stop the bleeding. If we're going to fix this industry, we have to stop the consolidation because it just keeps making it smaller and smaller and more problems. And so we have said publicly to the DOJ, we filed comments with the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission. It was the first thing I did at Economic Liberties 2 years ago when I first came on board. We filed comments saying, let's put a moratorium on all mergers in the airline industry until we can properly analyze the harms that we've already seen.
Right.
Because it's Groundhog Day, James. We treat each of these mergers as if there haven't already been dozens of mergers before, and nobody ever goes back and looks at all the false promises and the things that didn't happen that they said were going to happen, right? And it's going to lower fares and it's going to be great, and and we see less service, fewer routes, fewer nonstops, et cetera, closure of hubs, And we talk a lot about regional inequality. And I think a lot of times people think rural states and they think, Montana, Idaho. That's true. Those states are very, they're really harmed. But what about places like St. Louis,
Oh,
Cleveland,
yeah. Huge.
Cincinnati, Pittsburgh? These are big cities with Major League Baseball teams that don't have hubs anymore. And they, they lose corporations. They pick up and move. You're not going to have your sales staff making 4 flights a day when they could do 2, right? And so they say, okay, well, if there's no hub, we're gone. So we're looking at economic liberties right now as we speak, and this has nothing to do with the Spirit JetBlue ruling. This just happens to be coinciding with it. In the next couple of weeks, I'm doing a little teaser here, but we're going to be making some announcements on some fundamental recommendations for fixing this industry. And one of them is addressing that, is saying, we're not saying that airline CEOs don't know what they're doing. They know what they're doing, but they have their interests and the public has theirs, right? And when you close a hub in a big place like Cincinnati, you're hurting an entire region, millions of people, and corporations, as I say, pick up and move out. It costs jobs. And so we're saying it's time to fix, what's broken.
No, absolutely. Well, on that note, and I think the next time we'll be speaking with you is after you issue that report on your recommendations for airlines. I'd love to get back on to do an interview with you then to talk about those considerations and those recommendations. Bill, always fascinating. I guess congratulations are in order because this is a result that you wanted and is actually every passenger should want in the airlines today. And I know you were there at the beginning. I talked to you, as you said, up in the hotel room in Boston at the beginning of the trial, and to find out pretty quickly, actually, for a trial, that the judge rules against the merger was probably a victory for you as an organization, but also for airline passengers in the U.S. So again, thank you for taking the time today to explain this, this ruling. It was a major ruling in airlines, and we'll see what happens with the Alaska Hawaiian thing. Well, we'll see what have to happen with that one. But after that, there's really nothing else on the table. So again, great to see you, Bill, and we'll see you soon as soon as your report comes out.
Excellent. Let's lock something in, and we'll be talking soon. But it's always a pleasure. Thanks, James.
I'm James Shillinglaw, and this is Insider Travel Report.